Hello and welcome. On behalf of the Global Agri-Food Tech Alliance, welcome to today's discussion on understanding the significance in addressing climate change of the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act and understanding the EU's response to it. I'm Joanna Gordon. I'm head of the Global Agri-Food Tech Alliance. This is a membership-based organization founded in 2022 by some of the leading actors across the agri-food tech ecosystem, and really the intent is to bring together these companies that share a common goal of raising the awareness of the issues that are plaguing the current food systems, and as a collective, how can we leverage innovation and technology to develop and deliver more sustainable solutions to transform the same food systems. As part of the Global Agri-Food Tech Alliance activities, we host every month some learning and exchange sessions. And so definitely check out our website, www.gadalliance.org, to see some of the upcoming programming. The next one is on March 22nd, and we'll be focusing on more of a hands-on approach of getting the Lee Resch, the VP Sustainability at Aleph Farms, as well as Leslie Capin, the Director of Impact and Sustainability at Astonor, who will sort of talk us through about how to even begin a sustainability process. But for today, totally different topic. I have three incredible panelists. First of all, Georgina Wright, who is a senior fellow and director at the Institut Montaigne, focused on the European program. We have André Lescroc-Pietri, who is the chairman of the Joint European Disruptive Initiative, better known as JEDI, in a much easier way to remember it. And Tom Howard, who's the editor of Climate News and a freelance environmentalist journalist. So the purpose of today really is, of today's discussion, is really to answer some of the following questions. First of all is, what is the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act? How does it even fit into the whole discussions around climate action? And then at some point we'll shift over and sort of explore what this might mean for food and agriculture and, you know, some of these new green tech companies around the world. So maybe to kick this off, we'll start maybe with the journalist, Tom. Do you want to sort of share with us, like, how would you describe today the purpose of the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having me on, Joanna. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act really is, it's a mammoth piece of legislation that was passed last year by Joe Biden in August. And it sort of covers, confusingly, not that much of it is aimed at reducing inflation, although partially it is. Part of it looks at changing the tax system in the US, raising corporation tax, and giving the IRS more powers to close tax loopholes to try and reduce reduction through that. Another part of it looks at healthcare, so bringing down the cost of medication in the US, allowing the Medicare system to negotiate more with pharmaceutical companies. And then I guess the main part that we're really interested in is the sort of energy security and climate technology part of the bill, which is to the tune of about $370 billion worth of tax credits and subsidies that are designed to increase US competitiveness in the clean technology sort of industries, to really grow them, to allow for increases in productivity, changes in innovation. And these tax credits are available for lots of different industries within that sort of climate change space, from big companies to small businesses, startups, and then right down to the consumer as well. So a really common example that is quoted quite a lot in the news is looking at the incentives for consumers to buy electric vehicles, for example. So they are, you can get $7,500 worth of tax credits if you buy a new electric vehicle. But then the key part really of this as well is that the strings that come attached to these incentives. So what they're trying to do is boost US domestic production and innovation in the climate space. So going back to the electric vehicles, for example, if you want to take advantage of those tax credits to buy an electric vehicle, then the battery technology needs to be, first of all, the critical raw materials need to be extracted in the US. At the moment, only 40% of them, but that will increase over time. And then the battery itself needs to be manufactured in the US. And again, not completely at the moment, but by 2028, they want 100% of the battery to be manufactured. So it's really quite an inward looking, domestically boosting these green technology industries, but in a way that's never happened before in the US. Like, it's absolutely massive.
So maybe picking up on this in a question, and either Georgina and Andrea, I'll let either one of you react to this, is I guess that Europe has sort of, based on what you just said, Tom, reacted to this whole, you know, that this is very much of a trade war almost that we're starting potentially between US and Europe. Are you afraid, do you think that if that's the way it's perceived around the world, that that is actually going to, rather than be a whole, rather than incentivizing climate change practices, we're going to be shifting the focus to just trade again, and not, you know, and sort of having it be counter effective in a way on a global scale. So I'll let either one of you sort of take, you know, respond to them.
Andre, do you want to go, or shall I go? I mean, I think it's quite interesting talking to people in Washington about the IRA, because they say, you know, the idea is to like bring down the prices of green tech and production costs, but also then of course prices and costs for consumers down in the United States, and then de facto globally as well. So they really see it as kind of a domino effect, and it being, they're being quite clear about the fact that they want the US to be a leader in green tech, but they think that's good for the United States, but also good for the rest of the world. On the question of a trade war, I mean, I think what the biggest lesson, and I wrote a piece about this in December, is I think the EU's preoccupation, but also, you know, the UK's and Norway's and South Korea and Japan, basically a lot of those trade partners of the United States, many of which don't have a trade agreement with the US, fear that the US is going down the route that China has already gone down, which is to support massively your own industry. And the question is, how can you compete if you have the two sort of major powers, you know, putting national preference at the heart of their industrial policy? Because in a way, then you're skewing trade policy, because you're favoring and helping your own industry. And so that it might be much more difficult to compete with that. So in a way, I think both sides are right. You know, the US doing more on climate change will bring down costs globally, but equally, there is a risk that other countries and companies in other countries can't compete. And that's what the other thing, because Tom, you know, eloquently and beautifully summarized this like mammoth package, as he put it. But I think the real kind of piece or aspect of it that's problematic is the $40 billion of tax credits to promote carbon capture, clean hydrogen, and investment in clean energy technologies. Because at the moment, if you look at sort of who's leading on that, well, Europe is, I think Europe, and that includes the UK, holds 15% of global production in those sectors, whereas the United States is only in 10% of global production. And so that is the question, is, okay, we've got, clearly we have China and the US that are overwhelmingly going to support their own companies. If you take the case of the United States, they also have low energy prices. So you have a number of companies in the EU that are ready to relocate, because as Tom said, you can only benefit from some of those tax breaks or subsidies if you're located or producing in the US or on North American soil. And so the question is, will that continue? Is that a trend that continues? And what can the EU do? And I guess the rest of the conversation will be looking at that. What can the EU and other countries do to respond to that and to make sure that they can continue having a thriving and competitive green tech industry?
Yeah, Andre, do you, I mean,
yeah. Maybe a few points to add to Georgina and Tom. First, what happens is a huge issue of lack of anticipation on the side of the EU. I mean, what is today called the IRA was called the Build Back Better in Joe Biden's presidential program already 3 years ago. It was actually twice as big. It was just cut in two and more than two by a very active senator called Manchin, who reduce the package of Biden. So the fact that we are now seemingly surprised is a really political failure on behalf of Brussels and of the European capitals. Secondly, to Georgina's point, she's totally right regarding smaller countries. I mean, it's definitely going to school capacity to actually create its own industry in these sectors, but that's true for smaller or less developed countries. That's not the case of Europe, which had a boulevard, as we say in French, for almost 2 decades on green technologies. And I think the reaction of the EU, which is very acrimonious and very stressed on that point, actually is some kind of a frustration that, number one, the US are doing what we've been asked the US to do for the past 10 years, is to be much more engaged on climate. Now, finally, they do it, and they don't forget their own interest. No surprise on that. And secondly, they do it in a way which is pretty simple and very straightforward, and they also cover the whole value chain. And I must say, without being a big admirer of the current administration and neither of the past U.S. administration, one must recognize that the IRA has a clear vision, clear pillars. We will talk about agriculture. Georgina just talked about the pillar on clean technologies. Very far from the complexity of the European farm to fork strategies, to give just this example, which even the experts have difficulties to understand how it exactly works, and the jungle of financial instruments, which we have many. Often we hear that there's not enough money in Europe. Actually, there are many financial instruments, but we have just created such a maze that it's extremely complicated to use. Last but not least, to Tom's point, I think what we're seeing is the US going back into good old industrial policy, but actually not good old. It's industrial policy 2.0, where basically there are clear guidance which is given in several sectors, but with the intention of letting the civil society, entrepreneurs, companies to make sure that they have the assurance that this is going to happen. Look, just in contrast, and to finish on that point, with the uncertainty that we're creating in Europe just on things around the end of terminal engines. Will it happen? Will it not happen in 2035? We're 12 years from the deadline, and we still don't know it. Very difficult to make investment decisions in this framework.
So actually talking about this, I was recently in a conversation with 2 of the CEOs of some of the founding members of the GATA Alliance. And they were pointing out that one of the biggest challenges for them was sort of the capex and the scale up for them and the challenges, and that private capital is not enough. I mean, these, I'm going to say, controlled environment agriculture, cultivated meat, these require huge capital expenditures. And that it's really going to be sort of public policy and a mixture of, public capital that are going to make that shift if we're going to see these sectors grow at scale. Really, that's going to be a requirement. Do you think that the IRA, through its grants and loan programs, is going to help sort of de-risk the investment for some of the private sources of capital for these capital intensive solutions? And I'm really talking, this is as applicable for agri-food tech as some of the other green tech solutions. And I know Europe has talked about, opening a fund to sort of help fund some of these. So would love to sort of get your reactions on, do you think we're going to see some of these new sectors scaling up with this or not, and seeing government sort of help the investment for industries that are specifically capital intensive and that aren't getting that, that investment in order to really scale today?
I think, first of all, just quickly going back to the point that you made about whether there could be a trade war going on. I think initially when this was announced, I think, as Andre rightly put it, the EU was caught off guard, and it shouldn't have been. And I think they were a little bit hurt, and there was talk of going to the World Trade Organization and sort of arguing that these were not fair for the international trade competitive laws. But that seems to have been mostly squashed now, and the EU seems to be more on the side of getting on with investment. In terms of whether we can see de-risking of these industries, I think what was interesting is in the US, when the IRA was being drafted, a lot of the debate, particularly from the Republican side, was that, if these industries are so great, if, electric vehicles, if clean tech is so amazing, then the private sector will naturally find a way to do this anyway. But the argument counter to that really is that, as was rightly said, China has been investing heavily subsidizing these industries for a good few years now. So regardless of whether in the future these are super profitable industries, you can't compete on a scale like that without subsidizing them. And it definitely will de-risk and help these different industries to grow much more quickly than it would be possible without government intervention. I think that's generally agreed by the people who were in favor of this.
Maybe a point I can add to Tom's. I mean, in Europe, when we have a problem, we create a fund. That seems to be the very simple policy making today. It would be very interesting to know what is the impact of all the funds that have been created in the last 15 and 20 years. And unfortunately, I don't think the result would be great. Here, I will take a counter intuitive reaction. Obviously, more money is always better than less money. But I think that what we are lacking in technology in general is the scale. I mean, these two markets have continental upsides. When you do it big in Europe, you make a big French deep tech company or a big German deep tech company. Since we have 27 regulations actually on most of the technology sectors of the future, talk about cyber, 27 agencies, quantum, 27 strategies, AI, 27 strategies. You actually have the same downside in Palo Alto, in Munich, or in Beijing, but you don't have the same upside. And therefore, obviously, there's less VC money that is going to flow into it. So you can throw as much money from the European Investment Fund or from the KfW or from BPI as much as you want. It will obviously always do good, a bit of good, but it will not have the transformational effect. So the real political act that I think we should be pushing for is to really get the single technology market going. And today we are very far from it. Just think about energy, which is the most obvious crisis we are facing, where you have big distortion between the different European countries. So that's point number one. And point number two is let's focus also where it's needed. The de-risking is really needed where you have really disruptive technologies, very initial stages where the business case is not clear. And it's not a liberal point of view to say that. I think we should abstain. At least we should focus the precious public money on these areas rather than to try to create mega fund and to do what actually large VC funds or large private equity funds already do. And I see the tendency to go actually the opposite way because of this, I think, false interpretation of what is the issue in Europe. But I'm on that one, I'm not very confident because I don't see any effort of really creating a single market because of legitimate national interests.
Yeah,
Georgina, do you want to react?
Yeah, but very quickly. I mean, there are a couple of other big differences between, if you take the single market and the way that the US market functions. We don't really have many European champions. We have national champions, so it makes it very difficult to start justifying. And it's harder, isn't it, to kind of justify why an Estonian euro should go to a German company and vice versa. The second is the way that the subsidy regime is very different. So in the US, if you take the example of subsidizing kind of carbon capture or clean hydrogen, those subsidies are largely uncapped. That's definitely not the case in the EU. And also you can use subsidies in the United States for R&D and innovation like you can in the EU, but also for manufacturing and production needs, which helps you for scale up. And you can't do that in the EU. It's limited to R&D and innovation. And I think the fourth thing is, you know, the US is just much it's just much faster, sorry, to kind of give out and dish out the money. So, you know, you've got regional governors, state governors in the US going around Europe saying, well, come to us and we'll, you know, within two months, you'll have all the money that you need. Whereas if you do something in the EU, and it's not just the EU, that, you know, the UK suffers a little bit from the same problem in other countries as well. It can, for a wind turbine in the EU, can take up to 7 years before you get the money. So I think there are lots of things that you can improve without talking about big funds and money, because I agree. I think throwing money at something when there's you don't create demand, you sort of, you meet demands. And so in a way, if we just think about money and funding, we might be missing the point, which is what the European Commission is saying in its proposals, which are there ways that we can improve the existing regulatory regime to help companies that are going to be competitive in 2030 and 2040 survive right now and scale up? And so I think it's a different way of thinking, and there are all sorts of questions of how you do that without upsetting the balance in the internal market. Because the reason why this regulatory regime is so rigid is because you wanted to prevent a situation where it was just like German and French companies leading, and you wanted to make sure that there was a balance and that a company from, say, Estonia could have the same chances. So it's quite complicated, but I think the EU is really heading in the right direction. And I've been following a lot of the responses to the IRA from Norway and the UK, and I think the EU has the most articulated response at the moment, and we'll have to see what other countries, including South Korea and Japan, do as well.
Just one point to build on what Georgina just said, which is a point which is little known. We are all very proud in Europe, and rightly so, on Next Generation Europe. It's this massive 750 billion plan that was set up in May 2020 when the pandemic hit. So we are now almost 3 years down the line, and out of these 750 billion, I saw that on recent indicators by the EU itself, 19% of the money has been deployed. So we have an execution issue in Europe. And I agree with Georgina, the EU is heading in the right direction, but the point is not to be faster than before, is we need to be as fast as the others. And here they are still light years away from the speed. I mean, for the entrepreneurs who are listening to us, I'm sure they understand great ideas, great visions, great speeches, superb. But the key is the execution and the speed of execution. And on that, I'm pretty worried, I must say.
What do you think, with any of these, with this new bill, what could be some of the unintended consequences? Do you see, for instance, the US, is definitely, the IRA is definitely focusing on, when it comes to US farming, still very much subsidizing and supporting some of the existing farming approaches that are not particularly sustainable in the long run. There's still, so on one hand, the highlights are very much, we're talking about game changing, but on the other hand, there could be things that we don't that will have unintended consequences. We'd love to sort of get your from all of you, sort of what are your concerns as you see the IRA and the Europe respond to it? Like what could go wrong? And what do we need to keep an eye out for? Andre, I'll let you start.
Maybe two quick. From a US perspective, we looked a lot at what's happening in the agri sector, and there was a plan a couple of years ago on poultry and meat. It was called the Biden-Harris Action Plan for fairer meat and poultry supply chain. And actually this turned, the first goal was to fight against monopolies in the meat market. And actually, with very strong environmental criteria too, it actually became a macroeconomic policy tool, more focused on production rather than on environment. So the first question I would have is the IRA really keep focusing on the environmental aspect, carbon reduction, fighting climate change, or will it become an industrial policy making America stronger? That's one point, and the second is what we see right now in the rate of creation of battery plants. I mean, Tom highlighted the fact that the automotive market and the battery market was a very important part of the plan. It seems that now the rate of creation of battery factories in the US is at least twice as high as in Europe. So you really have a distortion, and many investment plans that were initially planned in Europe are now diverted to the US. One example, and one notorious one, the largest European mega factory company is a Swedish company called Northvolt. They were supposed to do their third plant in Germany, and they seem to put that on hold and rather put that in the US.
I mean, I think, you know, you're hitting on something which, you know, in this whole act, you know, we're talking here, you know, in its globality, there is a whole pillar. There's 20 billion that's being allocated towards, you know, fixing the U.S. farming. But the reality is all the aspects that are around, you know, clean energy technologies, you know, so if you're looking at, as I said, again, controlled environment agriculture and things like that, that do require huge amounts of energy. The fact that we're going to start seeing, you know, clean power competitive prices in the U.S., is that going to, you know, is that going to, you know, impact the way, you know, indoor farming is going to develop in the US? And is it also going to change the, you know, equation for, you know, one of the biggest complaints about, you know, some of these solutions, that they're very energy intensive? So I think what I find interesting when, you know, we look at the IRA is that for some of these sectors that, you know, not just the 20 billion around food is, you know, in agriculture is really going to affect the, you know, the agri-food tech sector. It's a lot of the different aspects as well that we're seeing in subsidies across the board. So going to that, you know, and as you just said, Andre, you know, we started seeing European companies moving their operations to the US. I've seen, you know, some startups where their VCs are, their investors are saying, you know, move to the US. What, you know, how do you get European, you know, how do you convince these VCs to, you know, let these companies stay in Europe if that's where, you know, they, you know, and how do we offset that? Georgina, do you want to sort of react to that?
I mean, I've got my own views, but I'll go with what the Commission's proposed, because I think that's probably more of a realistic way of seeing how, you know, what the EU proposing to, how it's proposing to respond to it. I mean, I think first they want to kind of improve this regulatory framework. So they want to improve the subsidy regime. Some of the rules were relaxed already to deal with COVID, so that national governments could support their companies, and these rules were, the relaxation of the rules was kept on to face the consequences of the war in Ukraine, and now they'll probably be kept on further to deal with this, and the question is how, beyond sort of just relaxing it, which basically means that national governments can support their companies much more than they would otherwise, how can you make sure that that money reaches those companies faster, and how do you make the whole kind of applying for help much simpler and much more transparent? Because, you know, the IRA, the great thing about the IRA is how simple it is. You know, I bet even if you ask someone on the street who doesn't know the ins and outs and could probably nowhere near as summarizes it as neatly as Tom, they would know roughly what it was, and it's like support for it, and that simple messaging is, I think, is very helpful. I mean, the other things that the EU is looking at is how do you kind of boost skills and innovation, and so they're thinking hard about how they can provide that either financially or create new kind of programs and stuff like that, because that's the other thing. If you want innovative, you know, and competitive companies, you need to make sure that they have the engineers and the scientists and everything else. So there's a lot going into that as well. There's also a question of money. So as Andre said, there's this question about what more EU level support can take place. But I think that will be complicated because you'll have lots of countries saying, particularly those countries that don't have a big concentration of green tech industry, that will be like, well, why are we providing all this money for basically some countries are going to benefit from it much more. I've got an agriculture sector that could benefit. So that I think those are going to be quite difficult, but they are still looking at ways that they can support that. And then the other option is because, as Tom said, there's a question of components and where you source your components to produce what you're doing. And so the EU is looking into kind of sealing not trade deals so much, but kind of supply deals, I guess, to secure critical raw materials. So there's like a Zero Emissions Industrial Production Act, a critical raw materials act, and all of that. So there are ways of doing it, simplifying your regulatory regime and providing more money and saying, oh, by the way, we know that you'll need access to all these materials and we can provide them. And, not all companies are looking to move. I think if you are a company, you've just been through COVID and you're facing the consequences of the war in Ukraine. Well, obviously, if you look at the United States where they're ready to provide support, you can use that support the way that you like, and there are lower energy your energy bill is going to be lower. That is attractive, like you'll want to move. But there are lots of companies that are staying put, and I think they're just waiting to see what support the EU or if you're not in the EU, what support your government can give you. So we'll have to see. But I think, as I said, I think the EU's on the right track, but I think it becomes very complicated when you've got a framework. How the detail is going to be key, and that's obviously going to be hashed out over the next couple of months.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe, Tom, you might be able to touch upon this. A lot of these incentives and subsidies are really around, developing process agriculture, for instance, on the agri-food side, agriculture, improving agricultural processes and products so that we reduce the carbon emissions, or we improve ground and surface water, things like that, biodiversity. Yet on the same hand, these are really hard things for us to be measuring. We're struggling already to measure these across the board when it comes to, ESGs already, or all the, so how do, and how do we even start implementing some of these incentives? Any thoughts on what that entails?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to, first of all, I think that how we, particularly on the money side, as you guys kind of rightly said, how you dish out this money, you have to be really careful with it, because correctly, how do we measure a lot of these things? Is this money going to the right company? Another big problem with handing out a lot of money is that generally the companies who benefit the most from it are the biggest ones in the market already. So you can really sort of flatten the market and reduce the choice for consumers and reduce the competition, because if you're a big company operating in this space, then you have the best ability to make the most and lobby the most for these subsidies. So you're going to have to be really careful to make sure that we're not just giving the money to the big players. And then, as we come to sort of measure it, for example, in the agri-food space, if you're looking at how you measure the methane and carbon emission reductions, to see whether the money's going in the right space, it'll be really interesting to see over sort of the next 5 to 10 years, the results of that in the US and hopefully in the EU if we start doing the same. But at the moment, it seems quite unclear how you measure a lot of these ESG metrics and how you decide which company is the best to invest that money in.
If I can just make a point, and I politely disagree with Tom, and this is, by the way, why we are so fascinated about this DARPA methodology that maybe some of you listening know. Actually, the more careful you are in trying to make sure that you are picking the winner and give the money to the right one, the more complex you make the procedures. And sorry to say, the European way to access money, but American bureaucracy is similar to that, is just a nightmare. I remind, and this is a bit an anecdote, the Juncker plan, which was supposed, that's back 15 years after the financial crisis, was supposed to invest in topics really risky to make sure that we re-engage our economy, had up to 8 different layers of approvals. And you know what it means when you have 8 different layers of approvals. It's only those who have the right consultants in Brussels, who have a team, and anybody who has already done an application for public funding from Europe, but also from a member state, know that exactly, that you need a permanent team. So de facto, it excludes the smaller sector and it privileges the larger institution.
That's what Tom was saying, by the way, that was the concern.
Yeah, but when you put too much concern, you end up in good faith to the opposite of what you want. What actually we think should happen is dash out money very quickly, but be able to evaluate. But that has one major consequence. That means that within the public administration, which are supposed to, you need to have not just lawyers, but you need to have engineers, agronomists, AI experts. And this is extremely complicated because most of the people today in these categories are sought after by the private and the public sector. We talk too much about who we give the money to. We talk not enough and even never about what is actually the impact out of it. And the last point I want to say, which is slightly different, we always talk about subsidies. We forget one of the major role of governments, which is also the procurement side. When you do strategic procurement, you are able to guide actually and to de-risk some of these very risky investments. SpaceX, for example, very different from agriculture, obviously, is not at all a subsidy story. It's a public procurement story. And with the success that we know.
So we just keeping the time and because we're coming to the end soon. Somebody asked a question about if one of you could elaborate on the main differences on the agri-subsidy programs from the EU, from Europe versus EU versus US. I mean, I think right now, this is the first time in a long time that 20 billion specifically allocated, as I said, to funding to help fix the agriculture in the U.S. And even more so if you take into account, as we talked earlier about, clean energy, even transportation, electrical vehicles, all that, all part of the whole food and agriculture supply chain and impact and drivers of their impact. How do we see, do you see as, and Europe has had historically a very strong agriculture subsidy approach, but in the framework of the IRA, how would you say, what are the major differences? Anybody want to sort of take the lead on that? None of you.
I'm not an
I know.
An expert.
Tom, I'll
so
let
I'm
you sort of
deferring to the experts.
At a more general in terms, environmental standpoint.
Well, I mean, so from what I can tell on the agri side, there's definitely is a lot of money in the US now set aside for sort of rewilding, sort of more aligning agriculture with nature processes, which is kind of what has been going on just very recently in the UK. We've just passed legislation to replace the EU subsidy scheme, which used to be more based on, I think, I could be wrong on this, but used to be more based on the amount of land that a farmer owned, whereas now in the UK, we've replaced it with this ELMS system, which is looking more at the setting aside areas on your farm for green forestry spaces, forestry management. So a lot of the US bill is doing that as well. That's part of what the IRA is setting money aside for, to give people impetus into that. I think that there's also a lot of there's some money set aside for rural energy infrastructure and off-grid energy infrastructure as well, because a challenge that perhaps the US has that certainly Western Europe doesn't have quite as much is that there are just vast areas in the US that are really empty. And so providing renewable energy grid systems there is really difficult. So subsidizing the investment for a farm to have its own solar farm or wind farm is quite an important aspect and quite different, I guess, to the schemes that we have. Certainly in the UK, I know probably a little bit less about what's going on in the EU in terms of agricultural subsidies at the moment. And then I also did notice that there's $250 million set aside for agricultural research and development in the IRA as well. So that's another thing where the US, the whole point of this IRA is for them to become leaders in these industries. And if they're setting aside, a good chunk of money to invest in the next generation of agriculture and research, then I think that could put them in a really good step for the next few years.
I want to totally agree with Tom's points and maybe add two things. What I like in the current plan is this holistic approach. Is we're not looking at agriculture precisely, but we're looking at more a mission aspect. There is a point on wildfires, which, by the way, we also are working heavily on, which obviously will provide, if we see the continuous rise of extreme weather situations, might be a huge threat that today is still a very minor threat to agriculture. And then there is a smart water initiative, obviously talking about the topic of drought. And last but not least, building on this vast empty land, there's also a whole point on communities, building these rural communities. So going as far as topics as education, etc. So we are not talking about directly subsidizing the price of milk and butter, which was, again, industrial policy 1.0, but talking it in a more holistic view, which might have good chances to succeed because you think system and you don't think silos.
Georgina, do you want to add? Because I saw you nodding, or you...
No, I mean, I completely agree. The problem is, of course, is it's easier to think system when you're one market, one country, and that's the whole problem with the EUs. You've got 27. It's one market, but you've got 27 countries with different industries that are going to be, competitive internally, but also globally. And so that it really is this recalibration. And I think everyone's touched upon it here about systemic view and system approach. Which is simply not always very natural. And I think the EU's response to that has been let the market decide. But of course, if you've got China and the US that aren't playing by global market rules, it requires a rethink and a shift in your approach. But and I think it was Andre who said it's how quickly you can do that. And time is of the essence. So I suspect we'll see a lot of change over the coming months.
And I know, one of the with this whole act coming to fruition, in my view, I find that the impact of the agri-food sector in terms of in the climate discussion and sustainability has sometimes, agriculture and food have not been one of the top sectors identified as being a contributor historically, and has, just by putting a whole pillar of the IRA around agriculture and food, changed the awareness in your view of the need and the urgency of rethinking our food systems, and highlighted the role, if you think of, and the reason I bring this up, take COP. COP 27 was the first year where agriculture and food even slightly made the main agenda. Hopefully bigger, intent is for it to be a much bigger part of the agenda at COP 28, but is this going to start, changing our perspective of where we need to be focusing our energy if we want to really have a dent on, changing the direction we're going in? Love to get your reactions.
I mean, I hope it does, but I'm sort of skeptical that the speed at which that happens will be much slower, and I think that's partly because of geopolitics, and we're talking about energy and decarbon. If you look at what it's going to take for Europe to decarbonize, I mean, it's just huge amounts of investment, and it's not clear where that investment is going to come from. And I think if we think about the huge amounts of investment that are required to reach what you've set out, and what I think with the public debate simply isn't there. It should be, but it's not, and so I'm sort of slightly pessimistic, I'm afraid.
Tom?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost shocking that agriculture seems so far out of the discussion. It's a really significant part of global emissions, and it is a real challenge, I think, as well. The issue is that we can try and fix agriculture in the US and the EU, but we also need to look at the whole global food system. It's, we've got deforestation for meat and soy products in South America. There's, palm oil, the situation seems to be getting better, but it's really complicated and difficult to know where your food exactly is coming from. So I think it's good that the US and the EU hopefully are going to try and lead on these things. But really, when it comes to agriculture, it can't just be a conversation between the developed nations. It needs to be a conversation between the global South and everyone else.
And Andre, I'll let you.
Yeah, what makes me, I'm going to be the optimistic on this side. Let's also not forget that our way of life, if I can call it like that, and when I say our in a very ethnocentric approach, I would say the Western world still concentrates most of the consumption that is driving, especially cattle farming and intensive agriculture. We are driving that. We are also home of most of the large food and fertilizer multinationals. So if we change the way these supply chains are organized, we can have not just an impact on ourselves, but also an impact on the whole world. So I think if we think it through, if we have the system approach, I'm hopeful.
All right. Well, on that note, I know that we're trying to keep our discussion sort of 45 minutes today. I want to thank all three of you very much for participating in today's discussion.